Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Jon Steinman, and he's here today to share with us his new book, The Grocery Story: The Promise of Food Co-ops in the Age of Grocery Giants. Now, Jon has studied and worked with all things food for over 2 decades. He was the producer and the host of the internationally syndicated radio show and podcast, Deconstructing Dinner, once ranked as a most listened to food podcast in Canada. Jon is the writer and host of Deconstructing Dinner, Reconstructing Our Food System, a television and web series currently streaming online. Jon coordinates and curates the annual Deconstructing Dinner Film Festival of compelling food documentaries and was an elected director from 2006 to 2016 of one of Canada's largest independent co-ops. So let's welcome to the show, Jon Steinman.
Thanks for having me on your show, Marianne.
What a pleasure it is to have you here. My goodness, I absolutely love your book. I have to ask you, what inspired you to write this?
Well, there were a few inspirations that led to the book. Yeah, one of them was having spent 15 years as a journalist looking into the food system. So food system being anything from the production of food on the farm all the way through to how it gets into our kitchens. I spent about 10 years with radio, with television, looking at really all the companies and processes that get that food into our kitchens. And I came to this place of realizing that there was a gap within really that conversation around good food, and the gap was the grocery store, where most of us are actually purchasing that food. And so I looked to see what had been written about it, what kind of media had come out on the grocery store and its impact on the entirety of the food system, and nothing had been written in North America that really looked at the impact of grocery stores on the people producing food, on our communities, on local economies. And so I really launched into the book process with that in mind, with trying to fill that gap as well as provide an alternative rather than just look at what's wrong with the grocery store sector.
Well, I'm so glad that you dive into that, because for a lot of people, it can be a little confusing if they don't have the background and experience that you do. I think with, you even talk about things like, just to start off with, like food co-ops. And a lot of people aren't really familiar with those.
No, well, there aren't that many, really. At this point, consumer-owned grocery stores, food co-ops, they are not very prevalent. They've been around for a long time, that's for sure. But right now, there are about 230 food co-ops, and they have among them about 300 locations. And so unless you live near one, it's not something that is generally part of, common comprehension of not only what a grocery store co-op is, but even what a cooperative is altogether. So, this is part of what I wanted to write about, was what makes a cooperatively owned grocery store different, because generally when you walk into a co-op, it might feel like any other grocery store. Certainly the products on the shelves aren't so dissimilar to what you'd find at any other natural food store or grocery store. But there's a whole lot more going on behind the scenes that really is quite revolutionary, actually, to the more dominant model of the grocery store.
What are some of the major difference between the giant grocery chains that we see and food co-ops?
Well, I think a big one is ownership. And for anybody that gets a chance to see my tour van, I'm on tour for 6 months across the U.S. And if anyone gets a chance to see the van, on the very back of the van, there's a question. And the question is, who owns your grocery store? And I think at the core of the differences between a cooperative food store and any other grocery store is who owns the store. So at a food co-op, the owners are the people who are shopping at the store, which doesn't make the store exclusive to those people. Almost all the food co-ops across the country are open to anybody to walk into the store and shop at. But when we look at the ownership of the other grocers, often what we'll find is from a privately owned store owned by one individual or a family, all the way up to large corporations that might be regionally based, national, or even international. And so that's one of the big differences, is by keeping the cooperative owned by the members, it means that the grocery store that's cooperatively owned remains rooted in the community it's operating. It means that the people who are making the biggest decisions around the future of that store are people that live in the community. They're people that understand the community. Often they're people that are engaged with other organizations in that community. And it makes for a substantially different type of a grocery store as far as how it engages in its day-to-day, how it works with local food producers, and how it treats the people working in the store. And so as a co-op, I'll use myself as an example. I'm a member of a food co-op in Nelson, British Columbia. We've been around for 45 years. And for me to become a member, I paid $50 to become a shareholder, which makes me an owner along with, in this case, 13,000 other members. And by being an owner, I end up being allowed to vote once a year for my board of directors. I have a strong say in the future of my grocery store. And another unique characteristic to food co-ops is that the profits that the grocery store is making year in, year out end up getting circulated back into the business, and anything that's in excess is often returned back to the members. So rather than at a large grocery store, those profits ending up in the headquarters of a multinational, probably in some far off distant headquarters, distant city, distant country, those profits actually remain within the community and get circulated back into the pockets of members. So I might receive a check anywhere from $7 to $40. It all depends how much I purchase throughout the year.
What happens there? Well, that sounds so encouraging. I think when people look at this and this model, it just makes sense, and it really empowers the communities.
I think that's a big part of it, is really taking a bit of ownership or control or stewardship, however you want to call it, of the food system. And while, as eaters, we don't have the capacity to really become that steward of everything within the food system, it seems like one of the best places to begin that is where we're interfacing with food on a daily or maybe every 2-3 day basis at the grocery store. And so it's incredibly empowering for me when someone asks me, hey, who owns the grocery store you shop at, for me to be able to respond, well, I do, along with 13,000 other people. And it's what seems to be the driving force for many people who are shopping at food co-ops. I've now been on the road here for a month, visiting up until now over 30 co-ops. And, most of the conversations I'm having, this is what people are saying, is how better it feels to know that the grocery store they're shopping at is something that is their own. It's something that, when speaking of the co-op, we don't have to refer to it as they. We don't have to use any language of separation. We can actually refer to it as a we. So one of the examples I use is when walking into a co-op, it's not quite accurate to say, hey, do you guys have any apples from that orchard down the road? It's much more accurate to say, hey, do we have any apples from that orchard down the road? And it creates for a very different reality, a very different experience shopping at a grocery store.
In your book, you talk about, some of the power that big corporation chains have in regards to just what we purchase. I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit for our listeners.
Yeah, well, I think one of the illusions of the grocery store experience, that is the dominant grocery stores, is that we are presented with this abundance of choice. And no doubt when we walk into these grocery stores, it appears like that. It appears like there is this abundance of choice because of how much product is on the shelves. But behind the scenes, there are quite a few practices that many eaters are unaware of. And one that I write about in my book are slotting fees. So this is a practice that's been happening in a strong way for the past 20 years. It's increasing in its prevalence, and it's where a food manufacturer is actually acquiring shelf space in the grocery store itself. So it's not what we would imagine, where a grocery store says, we like this product, we're going to put it on the shelf, and here's where we're going to put it. Instead, what's happening, not across the entire store, but in much of the store, particularly the center aisles, they're looking to whichever manufacturers have the most money to be able to acquire access to those shelves. And as you can imagine, the shelves that are at eye level are the ones that are the most lucrative. Certainly any of the space and shelf space near the checkouts are also quite lucrative. So when we think that we're walking into a grocery store and having an abundance of choice, it's not really choice we have. It's really whatever the the grocery store is presenting to us based on what prices they received from the manufacturers. So grocery stores are no longer just in the business of selling food as a way to bring in revenues. In fact, they're selling shelf space as well. And so this really is this. It challenges this idea that we can vote with our dollar, and I think there's a lot of empowerment in believing that we can. And I think to a very large extent, we still can influence the food system and can influence our communities based on what we purchase. But it's not entirely true when some of what we're purchasing isn't really a choice. It's really just whatever's being presented to us.
You talk about marketing. I mean, that's kind of really what it is. It's they're buying the shelf space and the marketing that's done for them. It has people kind of pausing and taking a look at what they're really putting in their cart.
I think so. And I think another part that really comes out of that practice is the challenge for some of the smaller, whether it's a local based business or a medium sized regional business. It makes it a lot more challenging for those businesses to get that food into the grocery stores we're shopping at. And I think, with more and more people becoming concerned with food, whether it's for health reasons or for reasons related to making sure farmers are being paid fairly or food producers are being paid fairly and trying to grow our local food economies and our local food communities. It's important, I think, for eaters to be aware that this has become a real challenge to access the shelves of the big supermarkets because of this practice of slotting fees, among many other practices that have really created these barriers to entry. And so, the food cooperative does not practice that, does not implement what are called slotting fees, these fees I'm speaking of. No co-ops are doing that at all. It's not to say that co-ops may never, but certainly from all the co-ops I know, co-ops are in the business of trying to support local food producers. And so I don't think we'll ever see that in co-ops. And so the grocery store shelves really are open and available to any producer that is creating an innovative, great product and something that often is, I think, healthier and returns more money into our local communities. And, once again, I think this cooperative model, because of how different it is to the dominant chain, is quite a revolutionary model, and yet one that's been around for well over 100 years.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for your book because you don't really hear about it too often. And when I went to your website, you can actually look up where the there's a co-op directory there, like where there's one near me. And there seems to be, co-ops kind of pretty close, I think, to most people.
Yeah, it's there's certainly areas of the country that are more concentrated than others. I spent about a month in just the northeastern corner of the United States, where it wasn't any more than an hour and a half to drive from one co-op to another. And so you can certainly find co-ops all over the Northeast, the Twin Cities of Minnesota, and really all over the state of Minnesota, Wisconsin. There are food co-ops everywhere. And there's also these examples now of areas of new co-op development. So groups that have formed, starting from a small core group, growing to hundreds, if not well over 1,000 founding members that are looking towards building new stores. And so on my website, I have a directory there that lists all the existing co-ops as well as all the ones that are in formation. And so areas like Chicago, in and around Chicago, there's quite a high concentration of startups. California, there's quite a few. And right now I'm tracking about 100 startups that are in some stage of development, whether just forming or getting close to breaking ground on a new store. So it's, I think, it's a new wave of co-op development, one that we haven't seen really since the 1970s, when many of the most established co-ops today formed. And so we're seeing, I think, a new wave that's particularly emerged out of the interest in local food, the interest in good food, healthier food. And I think the big grocery stores aren't providing that in the way that I think consumers are really wanting. And so this is one of the reasons I think we're seeing this new wave of co-op development.
In your book, you talk about the farming crisis of 1980. Why was that so important to put in your book?
Well, it was a period of time when really a lot changed. For farmers, it was a time where the good days of the 70s, where farms were actually doing quite well relative to what was then to transpire in the 1980s with the oil crisis and the recession. What started then was this uh, downfall of farm income, and farmers were finding themselves in the most difficult place they had ever been. And it was at that time when the Farm Aid organization, for example, emerged and began supporting farmers who were struggling, who had many of these farmers had actually found themselves in severe mental health crises. And it was really the beginning of what we still are feeling today, which is this food system that is not paying farmers fairly for what they're producing. And so I write about it in the book because we haven't actually got out of that period yet. We are still in that same period that began in the 1980s. And farmers today are in a position where, at least among small farms, which is any farm that's selling between $10,000 and $350,000 a year, which is really the bulk of farms in the country, 75% of those farms are relying on some form of off-farm income to sustain what they're doing, which isn't really a very true economy when the farmers, in fact, are subsidizing the food system by working other jobs. And so, yeah, I write about it in the book because we are still in that place, and yet we still have an opportunity now to change that, to take the ideas of fair trade, which I think have become more and more mainstream. These ideas of supporting farmers on the other side of the planet, which we still have work to do, but we can also bring those ideas into our communities and into right here domestically, so that we can be aware of the crisis that still is happening. And food co-ops are in this place where it's not really a matter of, hey, what can we pressure the farmer to sell our food, or what can we pressure that farmer to sell the food at what price, which is the practice of the dominant grocers. What food co-ops are doing is really saying, what do you need to sustain what you're doing, and here's what we're going to charge. And so this is one of the reasons why when we walk into a food co-op, it might seem like some products are more expensive than others. And certainly that's the case with local foods, because many of these food co-ops are really trying to transmit the fair price onto the price of the food on the shelf.
Well, and then it all trickles down where it's also, you know, supporting that farm, supporting the local, farming community. And I think more people, like you were saying, are so interested in doing that now more than ever.
I think so. And one of the other pieces I think that is becoming important is the idea of circulating our dollars wherever we're spending them in our community, because that ends up impacting all of us. And so one of the examples I use in the book is with a sauerkraut producer where I live in Nelson, British Columbia. And I use her as an example of how a food dollar spent on a local product can then circulate through the community. So I asked her, where do you spend your money in Nelson? And she listed off everywhere she goes, all the businesses that she walks into. And so anywhere from the local dentist or one of the dentists in the community, to our nonprofit movie theater, to the local ski hill, to the local brew pub, to the company that's printing her labels for her sauerkraut. These are all places where that food dollar then goes and circulates through. And when we start to think of our food dollar in that way, I think we can start to see just how impactful that is to everyone in our communities, and likely including ourselves, because these might be businesses and people that we are also going and supporting. These might be places where we are either working or people we know are working at. And so drawing those links and those connections is really important. And it's something that I think is most easily done through food, because, well, we're eating every day. We're walking into these grocery stores every day or two. And it's a way to really see the community and the impact of the grocery store on the community when we start to look at, where are these people who are producing our food spending their money?
Mm-hmm. How does this impact low-income food access?
Well, food co-ops certainly formed in the Depression era and in the 1970s as a way to reduce food costs. That was really one of many driving forces in the formation of food co-ops, was to say, okay, well, we can buy food together uh, at wholesale prices and divide up the wholesale purchases so that everybody saves money. And to a degree, that's still happening today. Certainly, co-ops are famous for their bulk sections, and that's often where we can find cheaper prices on food. And co-ops as well today are really amazing at passing on savings to their members. So one of the examples that is quite prevalent at co-ops is on a either biannual or quarterly basis. Food co-ops will run what are also known as truckload sales or case lot sales. So the co-op will bring in for either a day or even a week wholesale sizes of products and offer anywhere from 25, 50%, I've seen even higher, off of the normal price of that food. And these are times where really the entire community comes out and is shopping at the store for that period of time. I think a lot of people who work in the store don't quite look forward to that time because it's such a chaotic period. But it's something that people, I think, are really understanding is one of the roles of co-ops is to pass on as much savings as possible to members. And there's another practice, though, that's also happening, because at the end of the day, some of those prices might not even be accessible to people on low incomes. And so food co-ops all across the country are offering anywhere from 10 to 20% off everything in the store to anybody on low income assistance programs. There's a handful of co-ops that actually don't even require any qualification for those programs. And so that's pretty substantial to be able to walk around the store and know that you're getting 10 to 20% off everything in the store. And what's also important, I think, with food co-ops is they're not synonymous with natural and organic foods. So what we're seeing now is the emergence of co-ops in communities that don't have a grocery store at all and aren't necessarily interested in organic foods and local foods, which are generally more expensive because they simply cost more to produce and it costs more to pay these people fairly.
A lot of people talk about food having like a loss of flavor. What do you think influences this?
A loss of flavor is something that I write about in the book. It's something that I think is becoming more into the mainstream media. Certainly, we've started to see a lot about tomatoes and the loss of flavor in tomatoes. And I spent some time traveling to some of the largest tomato producers in California and got to see exactly what has happened over the past 75 years in particular with the loss of flavor in the more conventional tomato we might find in a fast food restaurant or on the grocery store shelf. And a lot of that's been driven by the grocery store. It's been driven by the interest to have that perfect tomato, one that can withstand long distance transportation, one that particularly can withstand travel. So it's a tomato that's quite firm, usually, that's being picked. In fact, tomatoes are being picked before they're even ripe, when they're green. And so what we're seeing, not only are tomatoes being picked when they're green, which actually reduces the amount of sugars in the tomato, what we're also seeing are breeding programs at some of the leading universities and breeding centers across the country that are breeding for characteristics such as yield, such as durability, such as disease resistance. And because we're breeding for those in particular, we're forgetting to breed for flavor. And so one of the outcomes of this has been that we've lost the genes in those tomatoes that are responsible for flavor. And this is something we're seeing in all foods. I use the tomato as one example, but I've done a lot of work on wheat as one example, where there was a time where the wheat that we were growing was in fact quite flavorful. And because we were breeding for all of these same characteristics, like I just described, we actually have somewhat, I think, forgotten what wheat can actually taste like, which is similar to wine. Depending on the wheat, depending on where it's growing, you can find very different flavor characteristics in the food. And so again, this is something that affects us at the dinner table. It affects us at our restaurants, certainly reduces the amount of enjoyable experience we can have with our food. And it really all comes back to the grocery store, a place where we have, I think, the power to change that by supporting a different type of a food system that is one where we see farmers growing different varieties, newer varieties of food. Certainly in the case of wheat, there are some incredible programs that are bringing back a lot of these varieties, and there are many local bakers that are starting to work with these varieties. So there's definitely a renaissance happening of new varieties of foods that we can start to, I guess, come back to the time where food was once more flavorful than it is today.
Well, that sounds like something that one could get excited about, especially when if you have tomatoes and they don't taste like anything, or that they just look pretty, we're kind of missing something there.
I think that's a big part of what compelled me to write the book, was really coming back to something that is really a very different experience with food, one where we can actually sit down and appreciate food. I think the way the earth has wanted it to be is one where we're much more connected to the source of our food and to the people growing our food. And it really, for me, started with flavor. It started with growing up at a time where most of what was available in my area were grocery store varieties of foods, and I really hadn't experienced what food could really taste like until I started to eat food from a garden and eat food from local producers. And really, I think that's what this is all about. It's about recreating a food system that is much more flavorful, both literally and one that's more enjoyable in our communities.
Well, gosh, Jon, we can talk all day about your new book, Grocery Story. I think it's such a great resource, has so much information for people. Where can our listeners connect with you and become part of your community?
Well, my website for my book is grocerystory.coop.coop. And there's right now a pretty extensive book tour that I'm on, and anyone who's interested in catching one of my talks or one of my book readings or just visiting me in one of the stores I'll be at can find a book tour schedule there. I'll be mostly in the Midwest and the West in the fall of this year, and certainly I'd love to hear from people as well, and so you can connect with me through my website, and I'd be happy to chat more about food co-ops and the grocery store business.
Well, Jon, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you, Marianne. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Jon. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you, and of course, to talk about your new book, The Grocery Story. The Grocery Story is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie bookstores. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.